This was the scene in Wapping last night as the staff bid goodbye to their newspaper and their jobs.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
It all started with a voicemail, a single message left on a phone that no one was supposed to access. But someone did, and from that moment, everything began to unravel. For decades, the police and the press worked side by side. Reporters chased stories, officers chased justice. The journalists relied on police for access, for information, and the police relied on reporters for influence to get their message out. It was a partnership built on trust. But when the phone hacking scandal broke, when it turned out that journalists were listening in on private messages, not just of celebrities, but of victims and their families, that unspoken alliance shattered. The way the police and the press communicated changed forever. But did the fallout go too far? And how did that monumental moment affect how you, the public, find out what's really going on? Welcome to the Crime Agents. Welcome back to the Crime Agents with me, crime journalist Andy Hughes.
And me, the ex-cop Neil Basu.
So Neil, we're talking today about the relationship between the police and the press, and you can't tell this story, of course, without looking at the phone hacking scandal. This all really began when, in 2005, the first story surfaced when aides to Prince William, they noticed that private information was being leaked to the press, or so they thought. An investigation led to the arrest of the News of the World's royal editor Clive Goodman and private investigator Glenn Mulcair. They were both jailed in 2007 for illegally intercepting royal voicemails. But News International, which is, of course, owned by Rupert Murdoch, they insisted that this was the work of a rogue reporter. And the police investigation, led by the Met, accepted that explanation and the matter seemed closed. But in 2009, The Guardian and journalist Nick Davies, he uncovered evidence that phone hacking was way more widespread than people thought. It wasn't just the royals, it included politicians, celebrities, and ordinary people were also caught up in the news. And Neil, the thing is, really, when these stories started coming out, actually, the public didn't really seem to engage with it on a huge scale, if I'm honest. And I think that's probably because, frankly, there's not a lot of sympathy for celebrities. But it all changed in 2011 when The Guardian did another story that News of the World reporters had hacked the voicemail of Millie Dowler, who was a missing schoolgirl and later found out to be murdered. And that was the moment that everything changed. That's when everyone, including the police, turned on News International and parts of the tabloid press. Now, you were instrumental in this process. Just tell us what you were doing at that time.
That first 18 months, a commander, later temporary Deputy Assistant Commissioner Sue Akers, was asked by Cressida Dick and the Commissioner of the day to effectively set up Operation Weeting to investigate what had happened. She ran that for 12 months. She was the one who formed the agreement with News of the World that rather than go in and seize the server of a national newspaper, you can imagine, containing all kinds of journalistic privilege and legal privilege documentation, they would have a third party come in, seize the server, and then each party would be able to interrogate the server for evidence required to prove what phone hacking was going on. And also News International would then be under an obligation to supply documentation that might prove or disprove their involvement in either phone hacking or paying journalists like Glenn Mulcair, the journalist at the heart of the first investigation into the two princes, paying them for either information that they would obtain using what was known as the dark arts, basically blagging people's personal information, or the bribery of police officers to obtain information, or other public servants. That was how it was all set up. I took over after Sue Akers retired. Steve Kavanagh, who later went on to be Chief Constable of Essex and then Director of Operations at Interpol, he took over for 6 months. And in April 2013, I was given the job. I was being given the job of Commander Armed Policing. We talked a little bit about that. But I was one of the very few chief officers who had an experienced detective background, and I was asked to oversee Operation Weeting, Tuleta, which was about computer hacking, not phone hacking, Also using corrupt relationships between officers and private investigators and press, and Operation Elvedon, which was about journalists paying public officials for information. So effectively either bribery or misconduct in public office. So I was asked to oversee those inquiries, and I did that pretty much until we closed the inquiries down in 2015, unable to secure a charge of corporate liability. So we had convicted a lot of people, but we could not get the News Corps, News UK, News International, as it's called. We could not get them on a corporate ticket because we couldn't prove the most senior people in the organisation, up to and including Rupert Murdoch, were the controlling mind of phone hacking. In other words, they knew about it and were directing it. We could not prove that.
Neil, I'm curious to know how you felt when you were handed this investigation. Did you feel, oh, this is a bit of a hospital pass, I'm about to become very unpopular with the press?
Oh, it's a total hospital pass. I'm one of the biggest users of the press in my career to help solve, quite often unsolvable crimes. We've talked about Operation Trident. My most famous case, the Byfield case, was solved by the media, including Crime Watch, the Liverpool Echo, various other stations, publicising that case and giving me the leads I required to solve the case. So there needs to be a relationship between the press and policing. Great investigative journalists. Yeah, you and I know this. You're an investigative journalist. I was a detective. We want the truth to come out, and actually working together has been a very successful way of doing that. It's a pity that some journalists and some police officers decided to do it in I was going to say unprofessional, that's the most diplomatic way I can put it, but a corrupt way, either selling secrets, selling sensitive information, uncovering things that caused, in our phone hacking, some of our victims, we had over 4,500 victims. So News International were able to say it's D-list celebrities to get to effectively dampen down any public appetite for them being held to account. You can call them D-list celebrities. Some of those people were pushed to the verge of suicide. Some of them had family and friends breakdowns. This happened right from A-list celebrities to D-list celebrities to politicians. And if you're starting to influence the way politicians think and act, you're starting to influence how a country is governed. This was much more dangerous because of those corrupt journalists, editors, and police officers and public.
It just massively affected the effectiveness of how the police work, and also how we got our stories. I remember when I was a junior reporter, it used to be a case of, when I was a local reporter, I used to just phone up the detectives. I used to bypass the press office and just call the detectives who I knew personally, who, I used to share a pint with now and again. That'll surprise you. And they would just tell me what information they thought was necessary. And it would help them, and it would obviously help us because we're chasing the stories and the truth. And if we're hearing from the horse's mouth what's actually going on, and then we're telling the public, then that can only be a good thing. And the phone hacking and the following Leveson inquiry, that completely changed everything. And that's when I first came to London, and I was working with I was working for Sky News. I was the producer of Martin Brunt, the legendary crime correspondent, who we're going to hear from later. And straight away, I could sense that it was going to be far more difficult for us to do our job than it was. And that has taken years and years and years to repair, and it's still not fully repaired. I actually think that during it's only the last 2 or 3 years, I would say, that you've actually seen a bit of a difference, where actually now I have these relationships with serving officers who tell me information that they feel would help, but that they want out there, that sometimes bypass the press office. And the press officers and the communications teams, they became so much more important because every single thing went through them. But the problem is that they're not police officers. They control what messages to put out. And it's definitely changing now, certainly at the Met. But just a couple of years ago, when Cressida Dick was commissioner, they seem to have this policy at the Met where it was just to give the journalists the least amount of information as possible, and it was a nightmare. And it was the public really that lost out in the end, because no one's really getting a clear message, no one's finding out what's actually happening. And then when you're blindsiding the journalists, how are we meant to inform the public about what's going on if we're being blindsided and we're being ignored? And sometimes the requests weren't even answered whatsoever. But I'm starting to see and feel a change now, certainly with since Mark Rowley became commissioner and he brought his own communications team with him. And there's definitely a lot more clarity, and there's definitely more communication.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's really useful. And I remember the commissioner saying, we got it wrong in the past. So pre-Leveson, we were too close, and some of those relationships were wrong, and we did the wrong thing. But then we went from there to a sort of Mexican standoff where we wouldn't talk to each other either, and that was also wrong. I remember, I think you told me he said that, and I thought that's absolutely right. And I think he is trying to bring it back to the middle. So a couple of things you said are really important. Press officers aren't responsible for what they say. They are advisors and conduits. The policy is only senior investigating officers, including the most senior executive branch of police force, have the ability to sanction what goes out. So that creates the problem in the first place, is press officers are scared that they will say the wrong thing and get clamped down on by their seniors. SIOs are scared you'll say the wrong thing and compromise an investigation. Therefore, it's easier to retreat and say nothing than it is to say something. And of course, if you're, as a very famous TV journalist once told me, I'm paid to put 2 minutes on air at 6 o'clock every night. If I don't, I'm going to be sacked. If you don't give it to me, I'm going to make it up. So the speculation that happens because we can't fill the time with some accurate, but nothing that's going to disturb an investigation, but with some accurate copy, is a mistake.
Absolutely, and I think this is what certainly the current incumbents at the Met have realised, that a void of information leads to speculation, and speculation helps no one. Next, we're going to be joined by the legendary crime journalist Martin Brunt of Sky News. He's the crime correspondent there and a former colleague of mine, and we're going to be asking him about the impact of the phone hacking scandal and where are we today. Well, I'm delighted to say we're joined by crime reporting royalty in Crime Agent Studios today. Martin Brunt, Sky News crime correspondent and host of the True Criminals podcast, is with me. Martin, how are you doing?
I'm good so far.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's really good to be here. A rival podcast.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Just for background, I was your producer for, well, too long. I think we worked together for many years at Sky News. Martin, we've just heard about the phone hacking scandal and the fallout and the Leveson inquiry. I just want to hear from you. What was it like pre-Leveson back in the day? And how did the police and crime reporters communicate, and how do you get your stories?
It was much better than post-Leveson, I have to say, although it's beginning to come back, that relationship between cops and hacks. In those old days, and I don't want to sound too nostalgic about it, there was absolutely no problem in journalists like me having personal relationships with cops. There was this perception in some quarters that any relationship between a cop and a hack was probably corrupt. And it really didn't work like that. I didn't know hundreds of police officers. I knew a few on personal terms. And it's not as though we were great friends, but it was always helpful to know individual cops when they were working on something interesting. And I can honestly say, in all my relationships with police officers, none of them ever came to me with a story that was particularly detrimental to their force. They wanted to tell me what they were working on, because we couldn't rely on the press office to tell us all the good stories that were going on. I mean, people always ask me, as a crime reporter, what is it you want more than anything? Yeah. And the truth is, I want good detective stories. Yeah. Press officers tend to be rather insular and spend a lot of time, police press officers spend a lot of time defending the force and aren't proactive in telling people like me the really good stories that are going on, the wonderful detective work. And we often relied on individual officers we knew to tell us what was going on. And that all changed with phone hacking that led to Leveson. And Leveson very broadly deduced that any relationship between a police officer and a reporter could be perceived as corrupt. And overnight, it really changed the way that I did my business.
So those contacts that you had, did they just stop calling or stop answering your calls?
All of that.
Really?
Yeah. Because, I mean, it wasn't just Leveson, but Leveson set the tone, and it was taken up particularly by Bernard Hogan Howe, who soon after became the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. And of course, you know, of all the cops I knew, most of them were from the Met. The Met's the biggest force. It has the most interesting stories. And Bernard, who I think it's fair to say wasn't the first choice as commissioner, felt that he had to buy in to this new mood and held a briefing almost on his first day saying he didn't understand why police officers and crime reporters or reporters had to do business over a drink or a meal or should have any kind of relationship. And officers were encouraged, and certainly senior officers were told that they had to record any contact with a journalist. And, you know, we all like to protect our sources from both sides. Yeah. So why would police officers want to put anything on the record?
Neil, from the police side, you were in charge of the phone hacking and police investigation. How was it for you knowing that you had to go after journalists that perhaps you may have known personally?
So going through all of that was quite a moment, but probably what you're referring to is Operation Elvedon, which was the arrest of lots of journalists themselves for effectively, you know, as we said at the time, aiding and abetting misconduct in a public office, a charge which was later withdrawn by the Attorney General, which would now be under the Bribery Act, basically paying cops for stories. And yeah, it's a terrible thing because I'm actually, Martin, hopefully you'll appreciate that I'm with you on the fact that the relationship is wrong. And I think policing and the Crime Reporters Association, which you are pretty much de facto president of, as far as most of us are concerned, we'll probably both agree that where we've got to today, post-Leveson, is a completely wrong position. But I'm sort of with Mark Rowley that what you described earlier on, there were way too many police officers who were way too close to press. And it isn't the relationship you were describing. I had relationships with senior CRA reporters who helped me solve unsolvable crimes using the power of the press in terms of witness appeals and appealing to the public and describing how hard the police were working to solve crimes. And that was incredibly valuable. And to lose that on the wake of phone hacking was a terrible thing and made me feel terrible because I knew as a senior detective how close the relationship had to be with media to solve some of those crimes. So that was a terrible thing. Did Leveson set the tone? I'm actually a fan of Brian Leveson, and I know lots of people aren't, both in Westminster, in the judiciary and in the media, but I don't blame him for this. I blame the cops who had those wrong relationships. And I blame the News of the World editorial team that effectively faced criminal justice. They set the tone for this. The fallout of it was for every other decent journalist and cop who were trying to make that relationship work.
I wouldn't for a moment, Neil, defend phone hacking. It was absolutely wrong. Although when it was first unearthed, I remember John Yates, who was a very senior officer who was kind of overseeing
one of my predecessors.
Yes. He said that he had a discussion with Keir Starmer, who was the DPP at the time, and there was a debate over whether it was actually illegal at the time. I don't know whether you remember this, and it all boiled.
I remember it very well.
It seemed to boil down to whether you intercepted the messages before or after the recipient had read them. Anyway, I mean that was eventually ironed out, and everybody agreed it was a criminal act, and I wouldn't for a moment defend it. And it's true that I think one of the problems with that kind of half-hearted first phone hacking investigation was that there were too many very, very senior cops at Scotland Yard who had too close a relationship with executives at the News of the World. I mean, that's my understanding. And of course, Paul Stevenson, the commissioner, had to quit. John Yates had to quit. And Dick Fedorcio, who was the director of public affairs, had to quit because of their too close relationship with those senior people at the News of the World. I mean, none of those three officers and Dick, the staff man, suffered any criminal penalty.
There is a reason why senior officers have to be so close to the Fourth Estate, a bit like politicians, because they understand the power of it and what it may or may not do. Now, whether that overly close relationship led them to not pursue phone hacking after the convictions of Mulcair and Goodman, the royal correspondent at the News of the World, and his private investigator, Mulcair, who was doing the dirty work, or the dark arts as they were known, whether it was because of that relationship or whether the relationship was so close that they were rather naive in believing the News of the World commentary that there's nothing else to see here. It's just one rogue reporter and one rogue. And I think that is the problem. They were so close that they were stupid enough to believe that that was the truth, as opposed to them being asked to don't go further because you'll uncover terrible things, as Operation Weeting did. I don't think it was because of that. So I don't think it was corruption with a small or a large C. I thought it was complacency with a very large C that was basically, we're prepared to believe your word. In fact, Rebecca Brooks, Rebecca Wade, née Brooks, we're prepared to believe your word that there's nothing to see here. You've got your man. You can drop this. And I thought, for senior detectives to do that and not follow the evidence and not pursue what they needed to pursue, I think, the Metropolitan Police has to take that on the chin as a failure. And Operation Weeting was always designed to try and restore, in some respects, the reputation of policing for following the evidence wherever it may lead.
I'm wondering where you think we are now, Martin, because I remember when I first started as a crime reporter, I was on a local newspaper in the northeast, and I remember when I first got the job, my news editor was the previous crime reporter, and she said to me, she was a bit of a legend in the northeast in crime reporting terms. She said to me, every single lunch, go to this pub. It was called the Steamboat, and it was where all the detectives went for a lunchtime pint, and it was where all the defence lawyers went for a lunchtime pint. And by doing that, I just I made loads of contacts just by going there every lunch. I mean, it wasn't great for my health, but and then when I came down to work in London, I was your producer. That was just right in the aftermath of Leveson. And I obviously found it impossible to make any contacts right now. Only really kind of now am I actually developing relationships with police officers that I have personal relationships with them. I go to the pub with them. We go for meals. And they give me information, or they will confirm or deny a tip-off that I may have. Do you think we're kind of getting back to where it was?
Well, I should say, firstly, Andy, that going to the pub at lunchtime for a TV reporter is probably not a good idea. And people say, well, you can drink water, but you can't really be in there with police officers or lawyers. Even when you're standing your own round, they get rather suspicious if you're not drinking alcohol. So I had to knock that on the head many years ago. I mean, sort of thing I did in my Fleet Street days. We are getting back to a better relationship. It's going to take a long time. But the trigger for that was the Nicola Bulley case in Lancashire, 2-3 years ago. The woman who went into the river was missing for 2 weeks until her body was found in the river. And the issue there was that she was a rather troubled woman with alcohol problems, some other difficulties in her life. We, in the old days, and I hate to use that phrase, but to be honest, that's how it's best described. At the start of that kind of investigation, the force would have taken us under their wing, the Crime Reporters Association, or reporters they trusted, and laid out on a secretive basis, you on a basis that you couldn't use it, some idea of her difficulties.
Yeah, it just helps with the reporting, right?
It would have guided our reporting,
Exactly.
and it would have put the damper on the more speculative stuff that we all pursued. The longer she was missing, the more we looked at alternative or theories for why she would have gone. If we'd known that she had that vulnerability, those personal problems, I think it would have informed our reporting.
Yeah, of course it would.
And the force in the inquiry that followed were rather castigated for not doing that.
Yeah.
So there has been a mood change where forces have become much more willing to engage us on that kind of basis.
Yeah, I mean, I actually remember that case, of course, and I remember the lead detective. She was quite aggressive with the press in the press conferences and really confrontational. It just felt a bit odd.
It massively complicated their inquiries, the fact that there wasn't a relationship, and what used to happen that you described, Martin, that I was very familiar with, didn't happen. So we had regular briefings with the CRA. At the Yard, you'll know, we used to have weekly briefings with the CRA. We had regular drinks receptions with the CRA, which were disclosed and open, but nevertheless were an informal gathering of senior officers and senior investigating officers and journalists to try and get to know each other before, while the sun was shining, before the crisis happened. All of those were incredibly important. They were not disguised. They were completely transparent. They were open meetings. All of that stuff needs to come back, in my view. I don't think it can be left to policing to manage the media. Even when we go, from Nicola Bulley, we go to Southport and the communications disaster and the vacuum that was created then because the police could not get their media out fast enough. It isn't just social media who can do that for you. It's legacy media with its still huge reach. Millions of people listen to the major radio stations, including LBC, Nick Ferrari, if you're listening. And lots of people need the widest possible coverage, and it cannot be for the police to just manage their own press coverage, because they will not be seen as transparent or trustworthy if they start to do that. That is a major criticism post Leveson, that policing has withdrawn into itself and now will only say, let's be honest, I watch police officers do press, and mostly they're terrible at it. And mostly they seem to be afraid of what they're about to say and what they're about to give away. I'd say to any of my colleagues who are listening that I think I dealt with the press, local press first and then national press, for 27 of my 30-year career. And at no point did a single journalist, either from local or national press, say anything that I hadn't said, or effectively say anything that I'd said had to be kept secret, published that without my authority. Not a single time in 27 years. And I think I'm one of the heaviest users of the press in my entire career.
Yeah, I think what's happened in the last dozen years or so can be boiled down to this, that police forces tended after Leveson to treat journalists as a threat when they should have been treating us as an asset.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
That's coming back slowly, thank goodness. Probably a bit late for me in the twilight of my career. But
well, and you're right about having to register people as contacts. It's, I'm not one of those. Do you remember that famous line from somebody in the Labour Party was wearing a T-shirt that said, "I'd never kiss a Tory"? I used to date a journalist. So there's lots of journalists out there who think I'm anti-journalist because I was head of phone hacking. I am not. I love Andy, for instance.
Well, you are a journalist now, Neil. Look at you.
I wouldn't dare of abusing the profession by calling myself a journalist. Great investigative journalists need to be regarded with the same respect that great detectives are awarded. The search for the truth, great investigative journalism is as important to the public as great detective work and finding justice. And somehow we should be able to do that together. And I remember the journalist I was dating telling me exactly how they used to get stories. As she grew up on Fleet Street, how they used to get stories from senior investigating officers. And it did involve sending the most attractive young junior female reporters from the newsroom into a pub where all the fat old male detectives, because they mostly were as senior investigating officers, were sitting, who loved to tell stories. And the more drink they got down them on the expense account of Fleet Street, the more stories they told. There was nothing corrupt in it. Nobody was exchanging money. No one was exchanging favours of any kind other than drinking and telling stories, because that's what detectives love to do. And that was a way of getting stories off the record that they could use, and sometimes getting scoops. Now, that cannot be the right way to go forward when there is an obvious and easy professional and open relationship that doesn't need to involve a pub, therefore excluding every TV broadcaster in the business who doesn't particularly want to go on air.
I was at a disadvantage, yes, in the pub stakes.
And you're absolutely right about my very first DI in the job said to me, I've never trusted a man who didn't drink. Showing somewhat what the attitude. I mean, that's an exclusionary comment from a male DI in the 90s, showing, if you were female and didn't like the pub environment, if you were a teetotaler or you were practicing Muslim, you weren't in his club. If you drank like a fish, you were a proper detective. And he felt the same way about journalists, and that's where he did his business, in a pub. And I was sort of brought up in that environment. And when Leveson happened, and when we realized it actually wasn't, the number of detectives who were selling stories in pubs amounted to one. The number of uniformed police officers accessing police systems on stories when famous people were either arrested. You could see in anti-corruption, you could see the numbers of people accessing those reports go through the roof, some of whom were being paid to a pittance of a sum of money to sell those stories to journalists who couldn't get their scoops any other way. Not by decent journalism. And that's what phone hacking and bribing cops was for me. It was lazy, poor investigative journalism that shouldn't be respected, and really drove a nail through the relationship between the police and the press. But also, you must have felt like we feel when cops like the Charing Cross 9 recently let us down so dramatically. And those of us who are decent people think, no one's ever going to believe us again. You must have felt the same way, Martin. And Andy, you must have both felt the same way.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as I said earlier, I never had a corrupt relationship with any police officer. I mean, I did deal with a very good contact who was an ex-cop who kind of left the Met in disgrace and used to supply the most astonishing stories. And I know that a lot of them he was getting from his still serving officer mates. And should I have questioned where those stories were coming from? Maybe I should have done. But when this chap would phone me and tell me, before he told anybody else, that Jill Dando had just been murdered, or the Queen Mother had died, and I was one of the few people in the country, in the world, who knew that information, am I going to say to him, sorry, John, because that was his name, and he was very proud of being exposed as a source for journalists. Am I going to say, John, I don't want to hear that?
No.
I'm going to unhear what you've just told me. I mean, two amazing scoops.
Any journalist worth their salt wouldn't even think about it.
Yeah, and I don't think the responsibility is on you as a journalist in that situation. It's on John.
Martin, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it, mate. Good to see you again.
And you? No, I've really enjoyed it.
No doubt I'll see you at a crime scene very soon.
You will, somewhere on the barricades.
Yeah, indeed.
And maybe when you're not reporting, I can buy you that pint in a pub.
We're allowed to meet now, aren't we?
I know we are.
Neil, last week, terror came to Manchester, and a man called Jihad al-Shami, a 35-year-old, he drove into a group of people outside the Heaton Park Synagogue in Manchester and got out and started stabbing people. The police arrived on the scene within minutes, shot dead the attacker, but also tragically one of the two dead victims was actually killed by a police bullet. Now, this is not only a tragedy for the family of the victims, of course, but also a tragedy for the police officer involved.
Yeah, absolutely true. I said at the time, I went on Lewis's show on Sunday to express my condolences for not just for the victims and the bereaved, but the whole community of Manchester, which has been through so much since 2017 and did not need this again. And also my friends in the Jewish community, particularly at the brilliant Community Security Trust, who were providing security as ever and helped, stave off loss of life from this terrorist. So I just wanted to put that out there on record, that I was thinking of them throughout, despite being a very, very long way away. And yes, you're absolutely armed police officers deployed to these circumstances. We have seen it many times since 2017. Highly trained officers approaching a suspect who may or may not have an explosive device are basically on a suicide mission. Had it been an explosive device, this man clearly wanted to be martyred by a cop. He wanted to be shot. That's why he was wearing the fake device. It is almost impossible to determine what that device is until it is checked over by an explosives ordnance disposal expert. What he couldn't have seen is who was, behind the door after he shot the suspect. And of course, the rounds these days, they're designed to stop their target, and so he must be devastated.
It's impossible for us to imagine what that must have been like for the officer. But I wanted to speak to someone who could help us understand. So I actually spoke to an ex-Met firearms officer. He actually responded to the Westminster Bridge attack, and he confronted the attacker. So I asked him what must have been going through the minds of the officers as they approached that synagogue. Here's what he said.
The reality is officers will know that this is not a realistic training scenario. This is very real. It's real blood on the pavement. They're real rounds in the gun. And this is not a game. And that is of itself inherently stressful. Add in things like, as was the case in Manchester, the appearance of a viable device, a PBIED, so a bomb strapped to the person. Those officers would have thought it's absolutely likely or conceivable that as they were dealing with that subject, there's every chance that subject could have activated that device and killed them. That's the reality. So imagine feeding that into your decision-making process.
Neil, he was using really visceral language there, stuff like, when you arrive, as good as the training is, when you arrive, there's real blood, there's real dead bodies. Of course, these firearms officers go through lots of training, and you have to get to an incredible level before you actually become a firearms officer. But still, this may or may not have been the first time that these officers would have been confronted with the real thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I'm fortunate enough in this or not. I say I'm fortunate in this because I have managed those officers. I was Commander Armed Policing for 2013 and 2014, and I've spoken to a lot of principals in the country who have had to pull the trigger having arrived at those scenes. I've worked on the post-incident procedures they'll have to go through having pulled a trigger, so how they're going to be treated, and I understand what happens to them when they're facing that. I've seen medical evidence, I've seen the exercising, I've seen the testing. I call it freeze, fight, or flight. Every human being, we're all little reptiles at heart. We haven't evolved that much. And when you're faced with certain danger and possibly your certain death, you're going to do one of those three things: freeze, fight, or flight. And the training we give these officers, only 12 to 14% of officers in the entire UK are armed, which means there's much more time to give them the kind of intense training that makes sure that they don't freeze, that they don't run away, but they are prepared to fight. And without that training, most people could not cope with the scenarios they're put in front of. And as I've said many times, thousands of firearms operations take place every year with armed officers going up against suspects who may be armed and dangerous and wanting to kill them, and they fire their weapons a handful of times. Thousands of operations, they fire a handful of bullets, and sometimes a tragedy like this takes place. My heart goes out to them. I hope it's reported respectfully and the way it should be. Just
to give people a little more detail what happened, the police said that two of the people inside the synagogue were struck by this bullet and it killed one of them. And they were basically guarding, they were against the door trying to stop the attacker coming in to commit more atrocities. And it's unknown if the bullet missed the attacker and went through. It's just none of this detail is available yet. But I can tell you what will happen is as soon as any officer shoots anyone, they are immediately kind of removed from the rest of the team. So this officer straight away would have had to be taken away by himself because he's not allowed to speak with any of his colleagues to make sure that everyone's recollection of the event is an honest one. So that would have been done. And then after that, the the police force, Greater Manchester Police, would refer this to the IOPC, who investigate the police. And then an investigation has now started into this incident to find out if any more action will be taken. Listen, this, on the face of it, just seems like a tragic accident. But we're going to have to wait for the outcome.
And the police officers in question know exactly what's going to happen to them. They are trained in the post-incident procedure, so he knows he or she is going to have to make their weapon safe and then hand it over to an exhibits officer. The bullets will be checked to know how many he booked out or she booked out and how many they put in the weapon and how many were fired. They will have their kit taken off them, just the same way you would be dealing with a suspect in a major crime. And they know that's going to happen to them. And they know that they're going to have to make their statement with, legal advice or with a union rep, a federation officer with them. But they know that's going to happen to them. But when it happens to them, it's terribly isolating. Even though they know that's the system, it can be a terrible thing. And of course, it's bad for them. But my experience is it's 100 times worse for their family. Saying that their loved one is being treated as a criminal for doing their job. And it's nice to know it's been reported well, but I will say that's because a terrorist has been shot. Look at it. When the same thing has happened with organized criminals, the reporting has been very different.
This is the extraordinary thing about firearms policing. They are trained to shoot to kill terrorists or serious threats. But when they do that, they immediately get taken away from that role, and they are then investigated. So all these firearms officers know that if they actually do the job they're trained to do, then that means they might never work in that unit again, and their lives will probably change forever. And this is the most extraordinary thing about firearms officers, and you've got to ask them why would they do that. But it's an extraordinary act to do that. So we'll have to see where that investigation goes. It's clear, because the suspect wasn't on the radar of the security services, that they're playing catch up, and we don't know what's going on in these interviews. But the main intention will be to gather as much information and intelligence as possible about this suspect.
Yeah, this is routine counterterrorism detective work that's happened here. So the first thing that happens when a terrorist attack is reported is both the security service, MI5, counterterrorism policing, the government, and all other policing databases will be checked for any knowledge of the person. And also they'll be looking for anybody who was mobilizing towards an attack. So they'll be looking at their existing suspects, checking that has happened. As soon as the person has been identified, clearly a name and address, a description can be put through that same system, and they will be trying repeatedly to find out if anything was known about the individual. I will tell you now, it's a particularly scary moment for the security service and for counterterrorism policing to realize that they knew nothing about an attacker. The press and politicians often think, well, if they were on your radar and it still got through, that's an awful thing. Of course, it's an awful thing. Every time a terrorist attack gets through, it is, we would describe it as an intelligence failure. But if the intelligence failure is one in which we never knew about the person in the first place, that is a feeling of, how can I put it, emasculation for people who are charged with keeping citizens safe and stopping that happening. But of course, we talk about this, the net or the radar or whatever. The reality is that's always been a fragmented net or radar. It's full of massive holes. You're trying to join up the dots to close those holes, and you need the intelligence on people who are about to commit this. The press will call this person a lone attacker. Whitehall calls it a single initiating terrorist. When that phrase is used, and I've seen it used in the press, is that what this person was? Well, we don't know that. So what we would normally do is look at everyone they were in contact with, what type of contact that was, perhaps we might even be able to see some of the content of those conversations, and we'll be able to decide whether or not there was a conspiracy, whether people knew but did nothing to stop him, which is also an offence under the Terrorism Act, or whether people could see that he was becoming more extreme but didn't realise he was going down this path. Either way, that is going to lead to people being arrested and questioned and detained until the answers to those questions can be satisfied by counterterrorism policing.
Well, we'll see where this one goes. I think we'll leave it there, Neil. We're going to be doing plenty more on Islamist extremism and counter-terrorism in the future, so stay tuned on this one, because this is still a massive issue. Thanks for listening to The Crime Agents. Make sure you've subscribed to us on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And remember, you can watch all of our main episodes on YouTube as well. Just search The Crime Agents and subscribe to our channel.
And we'll be back with another main episode next Wednesday and have a question and answer episode for you soon. So please, if you have any questions for us, we enjoy that part of the show, either about our real life experiences or something that's happened in the news, then send them in and we'll answer them as soon as we can.
And you can send them by email to thecrimeagents@global.com or follow us on social media. We're at The Crime Agents on all major platforms, and you can leave a question there. Well, that's it. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
The Crime Agents,